Hi there, and welcome to this new Outstanding History video. And I thought I'd discuss today a few ideas for either lesson starters or perhaps an entire lesson looking at the legacy of the late and very, very great Mr. David Bowie. Now, this might seem all very kind of gimmicky stuff, but trust me, it's not. The exploring a character like David Bowie is an inroad into looking at themes of change over time in attitudes towards ideas such as gender, sexuality, and social class. And all these ideas were up for the grabs, really, from the late 1960s onwards. And the question is, why? Why between 1968 and perhaps 1984 was the pace of change in thinking about gender, sexuality, and gender roles so rapid? What was happening? What had happened to society, particularly British society? But it is far from limited to British society. What I'm talking about applies to nearly every first world country. I'm sure it applies to third world countries as well, and I don't mean to exclude them. It's just I simply don't know. But certainly between in the late 60s, the 70s, and the early 1980s, Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Great Britain, and perhaps even Japan all experienced these changes in ideas about sexual freedom and the sexual identity. And David Bowie is really our kind of signifier that something is changing. Okay, so let's talk about him for a moment. Born in 1947, he was something of a kind of a musical opportunist, or a kind of a career opportunist. By the mid 1960s, he transitioned from being a kind of a mod to being a folk act, and in between he recorded novelty records, and really he was trying to do anything that worked. The breakthrough song Space Oddity was inspired by the moon landings, but in 1969 it's not really a hit. It's re-released in 1972 when Bowie rides on the wave of glam rock, firstly with his album Hunky Dory, and then the rise and fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. Now, a great way to start a lesson, and there's probably no more important or influential piece of footage about Bowie than his 1972 Top of the Pops debut playing Starman. At the time, would be a great piece of footage to show your classes. I'll see if I can add a link to it underneath this video. By all accounts, anecdotal and otherwise journalistic, the 3.5 minutes of the song seem to have electrified the nation, both in horror, shock and outrage from parents and fascination from children. The David Bowie is filmed with kind of bright red hair and an effeminate jumpsuit outfit, fondling his guitarist Mick Ronson, and in his kind of entire mannerism, it's not just camp, but it's androgynous. He's almost sort of beyond gender. Beautiful to both women and men alike, and this kind of ethereal sort of post-gendered personality was pretty unacceptable for the most part to Britain. His stardom in America happens really in the later 70s and definitely in the 1980s, but in the early 1970s, Britain is glam is a peculiarly British institution, and it doesn't really translate very well. There are sort of American versions of it, the guys of Alice Cooper and Kiss and things like that, but it's not quite the same thing. And the footage of Starman is credited with starting the pop careers of later British gay pop stars such as Boy George and Mark Almond and Neil Tennant from the Pet Shop Boys, and Bronski Beat, and an entire panoply of gay and lesbian acts. And if you look at the pop scene of the 1980s, there are an extraordinary number of out gay performers, and it's argued by many of them that David Bowie laid the groundwork, particularly as he announces in a press conference, and again, I'm sure I can find the footage for you, I'll check below and I'll put the link in, that he was openly bisexual when he's interviewed with his wife Angie. And this, both horrifies and delights audiences. And Bowie suddenly realised that this performance was working. It was making him extremely famous. And this is to present him as being, I don't wish to present him, but really as being kind of nakedly opportunistic. He was a combination of an opportunist and an experimenter, but he also had an intimate understanding of the way in which culture was changing. Now, this is the interesting bit. So, throughout the 1960s, from about the 50s and 60s, from about 1954 to about 1966, you have an unprecedented wave of economic affluence, the greatest increase in living standards in one defined period in British history, really, happens in this decade and a bit. As it happens, the choices that people make, the consumer choices that people make, career choices, life choices, are transformed. New ideas about personal freedom, social mobility, about when to have a family, at what age, and about stepping beyond the confines of traditional either working class communities or the kind of stuffiness of provincial middle class life in England. These things are energized by this long period of increasing consumer affluence and living standards. And Bowie understood really that new ideas about the individual were developing, and what was becoming less and less popular were notions of collectivism. These notions were finally founded in the mid-1970s. But the older notions of unionised collectivism, the kind of the working man's club, the church, chapel, pub, and the allotment, the traditional world of the masculine-dominated British working class, was in crisis, because there were children no longer willing to or interested in growing up to become part of that, and the collectivist institutions that had really dominated British life for much of the 20th century, such as trade unions and that kind of thing, were experiencing a gradual shift away from them. Their members were profoundly more individualistic, and whilst the unions in the 60s and 70s, of course, their members went out on strike together and engaged in acts of industrial protest together as a cohesive and collective unit, what was motivating them by and large were the aspirations that the 1960s had brought: higher wages, better living standards, and they were motivated. They worked collectively together and they protested collectively together, but were motivated by individualistic pursuits. So the tide of society in Britain in the 1970s, and really across much of the industrialised world, is shifting towards greater notions of individualism and greater notions of individual expression of identity through consumption, the individual expression of identity through lifestyle choices, through the choices that surround ideas such as sexuality. These were on the undercurrent, and David Bowie's great talent, other than his musical genius, was to be able to see how culture was changing, or how being able to predict how it would change. This is why much of Bowie's work, if you look at examples of things like Ziggy Stardust, are kind of slightly ahead of the game. They are new and innovative, but they predict the coming epoch. They predict the coming era, the coming decade, and Bowie neatly predicted how the 1960s and the 1950s, how the changes that were already afoot would translate into the 1970s. He created the music that would fit that, and this is really part of the essence of his fame. So how do we use this in teaching? Well, we can look at the images of a highly sort of effeminate David Bowie, and of course this is all fairly tame stuff these days as well. We must recognise. But we can look at these images of a effeminate David Bowie, and it might be possible to find the initial reaction to him. There are all sorts of anecdotes out there about how appalled people's parents were by him, and to look at changing different generational attitudes towards gender, sexuality, and gender roles, and how really society, even by the 1960s, an era supposedly of progressive change, was still heavily gendered. That men did men's jobs, women did women's jobs, and men that dressed up or acted in an effeminate way were to be laughed at and mocked. And these are the values of the generation who had really fought the Second World War and lived or had endured the Second World War, and it was their children, or perhaps even now their grandchildren, that were starting to experience very different attitudes, because their experience really had been one of peace and prosperity that had enabled them to explore new gender roles. So when we go right to the bottom, what we're looking at is, we're not interested so much in David Bowie or Starman or anything like that. We're looking at these fundamental forces within society of war, of depression, of affluence, of prosperity, that begin to shape culture. And so that's what you can draw out of your lesson, how these forces shape the evolution of culture, where it is ideas about culture actually come from. And they are rooted basically in material and political and social realities that form societies. And the culture is just the kind of what arises out of that. So there you go. That's how you use David Bowie and Starman and his glittering career to paint a picture of economic and social and therefore cultural change in post-war Britain.